Hello, I'm WP Suazo, and I'm here to talk about the Keynesian perspective on aggregate supply and demand. Keynes saw aggregate demand as being the primary determinant of GDP. And so that has caused his model to have a horizontal range in the supply curve. That sentiment on the part of Keynes has caused the aggregate supply curve to have a horizontal range, which means that when the economy has much slack, or when it's under potential or in recession, aggregate demand can change without any change to prices or price level. As we all know well, Keynes talked about aggregate demand collapsing and prices not falling because of the ratchet effect. So this is effective both ways. So here's aggregate demand. If aggregate demand is falling, because of the ratchet effect, prices do not fall. They are fixed. And if we are far inside of potential, if aggregate demand is surging or growing, if we're in the slack section or the Keynesian range of this aggregate supply curve, and I'll finish it and label it as such. So here's aggregate supply. We can accommodate more aggregate demand without any price increase, so long as there are idle resources in the economy. However, this here is the classical range. This here is the classical range. And what does the classical range say? The classical range says that GDP is fixed at potential. Aggregate demand, how much society or people clamor for resources, does not affect aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is determined by resources and talent, and it is where it is. And whether we want it much or don't have much appetite for it doesn't change that fact according to the classical economists. But let us operate more here on the Keynesian range. So this here, this horizontal range, is the Keynesian range. So this is the Keynesian range. And this right here is full or potential GDP. So in this example, a full GDP, say, is 20. And right now, let's say AD double prime is at 18. This would indicate a GDP gap of -2. But if the economy keeps on contracting, this negative GDP gap can grow, as it did in the 1930s during the Great Depression. Perhaps this right here would be a dust bowl situation right here. So to find the gap, you just take your current equilibrium and compare it to where the vertical section of aggregate supply meets with the horizontal axis. Moving aggregate supply. Before talking about that, I will just say that the things that vary aggregate demand are consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. But what could cause aggregate supply to move? Aggregate supply can move because of, or expand because of lower wage and energy prices and productivity gains. And as you see here, if we have a aggregate supply curve prime here, our potential or full goes from 20 to something greater. And if we're still on these aggregate demand curves, we're still left with a negative GDP gap. The last thing I will say in closing, according to the dynamics of this graph, it's impossible to have a positive GDP gap. Because once you get to the vertical range, it's not possible to have an equilibrium going beyond your potential GDP. Thanks for watching.